have you already done this, ma'am? Have you filled out one of those little yellow forms? Okay, that's the only thing we ask, is that you fill out a yellow form and that you don't take up more room or bring bulky equipment into the hearing room. So she stands once again as a perfect example of how to do it right. Let's all take a look at her.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, so we just have two bills to hear today. We're going to start with Senate Bill 705. I think we'll just start as a subcommittee. We'll have our Madam Secretary take the roll once we've kind of gotten into the process. And so, Senator Lauger, if you would introduce Senate Bill 705.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senator Brad Lauger here represents Senate Bill 705. Senate Bill 705 is actually the result of an audit that Auditor Swyke issued. And basically, the way that bonds are issued in many of our public institutions, there have now been 4 separate audits of how that process works, and all came back, both under Democrat and Republican auditors, with the same finding. And that is, they believe the taxpayers will be better off if there's a competitive bid process around the issuance of these bonds. So basically, and I think the auditor's office, and probably the auditor, since this was one of his priorities, will be here to testify. But basically what they have found is they believe that more often than not, in a competitive bid process, there's approximately a quarter of point difference in what the taxpayers end up paying. And when you think about, bond issuances of $10, $20, $30 million and up, that becomes real money real fast. And so we're going to hear a lot of testimony today, and ultimately the committee is going to have to decide how you want to move forward. As I said, this will be the 4th time an audit has made a recommendation to change the process, and to date, nothing has happened. So we understand that there's definitely a lot of money and a lot of desire on the other side to keep it the way that it is as well. Basically, Mr. Chairman, I think probably the easiest way to start through this is to go ahead and take the testimony. They're going to talk about it in much greater depth than I am. But as I said, the real issuance of what Senate Bill 705 really puts forward is, will we or won't we have a competitive bid process whenever local political subdivisions issue bonds?
Very good, thank you for that introduction. Do we have questions for the sponsor? Senator Shaw, go ahead.
Yes. So right now, banks are able to issue the bonds, is that correct?
I have no idea. I think often the banks buy the bonds.
They buy the bonds.
Typically the bond holders.
Would your bill prevent them from purchasing the bonds?
They do not, but I think the concern, and I'll let the
So it
banks
would
speak.
not prohibit them?
That's correct. But I think that the concern is that in a competitive bid process, they may not have the same opportunities to buy the bonds as they do today. I.e., there's going to be a competitive bidding process versus someone coming to them and saying, hey, would you like to buy these bonds at this rate? So when you change the process, you may change their ability to buy the bonds in the same beneficial way that they buy them today.
Further questions? Senator Romine?
Currently, they have the option of bidding the bonds or negotiating the bonds, correct?
Correct.
And this bill would just reduce it to bidding.
Bidding, that's correct.
Other questions for the sponsor? Do you have people to call by name, or should
I
we
think we'll start with the folks from the auditor's office.
Okay.
Probably the auditor, since this was his priority. Oh, no, I guess the auditor didn't make it. Or we, but the new improved.
So
versus the
as
auditor.
our first witness comes forward, let me just ask the audience, how many people intend to speak in favor of Senate Bill 705? If you would raise your hand, if you're going to be speaking in favor of Senate Bill 705. How many would be speaking against 705? All right, very good. And how many for informational purposes only? All right, so it looks like we have about 4 that wish to speak in favor, quite a bit more than that wish to speak against. So what I would do is, I'm not going to put a real heavy restriction on time allotment, but I am going to ask everyone to keep it as brief as possible, and particularly those of you that are on the side that has many people that want to speak, if you would be very mindful of what the people have said before you, and please not go into the same information that's already been covered for the sake of time. We do have an absolute hard deadline of how long we can be in this committee room, and so we just want to make sure that we abide by that. Will you be going first, sir?
Yes, Senator.
If you would, just state your name for the record, make sure that you fill out a witness form, and proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Harry Otto, Deputy State Auditor, speaking for Tom Schweik, State Auditor. And I brought with me today Bobby Showers, who managed the last engagement, the one that you received a copy of. And as Senator Lauder said, the Auditor's Office has done 4 reports in the last 20 years. Margaret Kelly did 1, Larry McCaskill did 2. Tom Schweik has done the 4th one. The most recent one was November of 13. Each of those analysis of general obligation bond sales practices in Missouri have shown that, in our opinion, a competitively bid opportunity requirement would result in a lower cost to school districts, political subdivisions, others that are issuing those bonds. I don't want to repeat too much of what the Senator Lauder has already said, so I'm going to move it over to Bobby, who can tell you more about the details and answer more of your questions if you have them.
Okay, so technically, we do need to open up the floor for questions to you. I don't think there will be any, but do we have questions for the Deputy Auditor? Seeing nothing. Go ahead. And of course, we need you to introduce yourself and fill out a witness form as well.
Sure. My name is Bobby Showers. I'm Audit Manager for the State Auditor's Office. And I guess the first thing I want to make sure and emphasize here is that we are specifically talking about general obligation bonds here. So there's a lot of entities that issue revenue bonds, certificates of participation, other public financing vehicles that we're not really referring to here. We're specifically talking about general obligation bonds. And I guess I'll just talk about in general about what our audit found. We found competitive bids result in a 20 basis point on average around their benefit over negotiated sales. Now, the reasons for that are very complicated because these are complicated financial instruments, but as part of our audit, we went out and talked to a lot of these issuers of varying sizes and types, and one of the things we found is that there just seems to be a very significant lack of understanding at that level of the issuers about the process and about the conflict of interest that does exist when you have an underwriter that provides financial advice on these type of arrangements. And we found issuers that, for one, didn't understand that for instance, we had one issuer that told us all their bids were, all their bonds were done through competitive sale, when in fact all of theirs were negotiated. They didn't really even understand the difference between the two. We had others where they just didn't understand the process in general, and so it was very clear that, and they don't have the expertise necessarily to negotiate with an underwriter when that time comes, because that's what a negotiated sale means. They give you a proposal, and then you have the opportunity to negotiate it. And that doesn't really occur because those issuers don't have the expertise to do that. The one issue that comes up is the comparable sale issue, and that they'll say, well, we give them a bunch of comparable sales, therefore they can be assured that their rate is a fair rate. Well, what we saw there is either one of those comparable sales aren't really comparable at all, or you're comparing a negotiated sale against a negotiated sale against a negotiated sale, and so it's not really helping to evaluate if you're getting the best price necessarily, just that you're not getting an outlier price or getting a price that's way out of line. It's really all that really is.
20 basis points.
Another, well, let me say this. I have some examples of a really good example, actually, of a comparable sale that's just happened a couple of weeks ago. Typically, we don't get a good comparable sale between a competitive sale and a negotiated sale. In this case, on February 11th, Lindbergh School District issued a competitive sale worth $32 million approximately, and Columbia School District issued a $50 million bond through negotiated sale. And putting those two issues side by side, they're both AA rated, they're both bank qualified. The only difference is competitive versus negotiated. And what you can see is, they have 11 comparable coupons, and 9 of 11, the competitive sale has a better advantage, or has a better rate on that particular coupon. And it's basically it's consistent with what our analysis found, which was about 20 basis points on average. So I have some details on that. Another issue that we've seen is there really hasn't been anybody at the state level to provide state level guidance or best practices, provide training to local governments, et cetera, as far as how this process works. And we feel like that's been a weakness. And for the most part, from what we've been told through our audit is that a lot of this training is done by the underwriters at association meetings, et cetera. So you've got underwriters providing the training on how to do these things. And we just don't feel like that's necessarily the best way to handle that. I can let you guys ask questions, or I can get into some of the general arguments against these things. I mean, we've heard a lot of the arguments against it already. I mean, they're pretty standard because we've done this 4 times. But
Well, let's go ahead and open it to questions then. Do we have questions to listen to Senator Shaw?
So, I'm not a banker, unlike other members around here. But I need a little bit of primer on what's going on here. So, a school district wants to raise a bunch of money. What does it do? Goes to a bank and asks them to negotiate a bond sale, or what is it?
There's a process where they have to determine, what they need, whatever it is, if they're building a building or whatever. But no, it doesn't involve banks at that point. It involves, that's where your underwriters, or you can hire an independent financial advisor to help you structure this deal. How much money do we need? How many years do we want to pay it over, et cetera. And then at some point, that bond issue goes on sale, and we as the school district get our money.
What is it, online?
Competitive sales are done online, yes. Negotiated sales there isn't a bid process, so it's.
So if I'm going to try to sell my bonds, then there's a marketplace online where I go to that website and then people bid on the.
Right, I'm not a financial advisor, so I can't tell you the ins and outs of how that process works, but yes, that process is available electronically.
Well, do they bid on by the interest rate, like, so you have $50 million that you need to raise, you mentioned the 50 million. So how does that work? Is it in like increments, like $1 million times 50, and different people bid, like, I'll give you the $1 million for a lower interest rate?
No, an underwriter purchases that entire issue. I guess that in some cases they can combine efforts to buy, if it's a large issue, but for the most part, it's one underwriter buys the entire issue, and then that underwriter serves as basically a middleman to then go and sell that to investors in smaller.
And they bid on a lower interest rate?
The underwriter bids on the whole block, the whole issue. And then they then in turn sell that issue into smaller blocks to investors, sometimes the whole thing, but they sell it to investors.
Well, who's bidding? Where's the bid? Is it between underwriters?
It is, yes, multiple underwriters, and a competitive sale is between multiple underwriters, yes.
Okay, and they're bidding,
Which some of those underwriters aren't
And-
banks, I mean.
and so
banks.
the underwriters say, okay, I'll do the whole thing for a lower interest rate, and another one says, no, I'll do it even for a lower interest rate than that, and eventually one of them wins that gets the lowest of all interest rates.
Correct.
And then they sell it to other people. I got you. Now, how does the negotiated bid thing work?
The negotiated bid works, as far as the structuring is concerned, it works basically the same. I mean, you structure it however you needed to have it structured as an issuer. And then when it comes time to sell that issue, there's not a competitive process. I've helped you, if say I'm an underwriter, I've helped you structure this thing, and then I'll sit down and I'll say, okay, well, here's what I'm going to offer you for your bond issue, and that's what you get for it. Well, there can be some negotiation, but we didn't really see a lot of that happening. And so it's a matter of that underwriter provides a price for it.
Are these underwriters usually the banks that we're talking about?
In some cases, I mean, you're talking, I don't know, can I think we're talking about, or do we're talking, like, you're talking, there's separate underwriters. You're talking about, there are some like U.S. Bank, and there are some banks involved, but there's George K. Baum, Piper Jaffray, L.J. Hart, underwriters that are those are the kind of the main players in government.
Okay. Why do banks care about this? They obviously do.
Right. We feel like there's a lot of interest in some of those local banks holding some of those bonds. And there's an argument that on a negotiated sale, you can provide some of these bonds to the local level, where if you do it competitively, that's not either not possible or it doesn't really happen.
What do you mean by provide them to the local level?
Meaning they can sell them to the local banks at whatever rate they because it's the underwriter can do with that what they want. And if a bank from, say, New York wins a competitive bid, they're not necessarily going to care if it's sold to the local level or not. And I don't know, we've heard some discussion about the, help me out, Harry, what's the reinvestment stuff? The Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to invest certain amounts in local investments, et cetera. I'm not necessarily sure if that's how big the situation is. I mean, that's not something that I'm very well versed in, honestly. But we also feel like there's a potential in this bill to put some sort of floor on it to make it only eligible for bonds that are over a certain level, potentially. Some of those smaller bonds would not necessarily benefit by competitive sale as much as some of the larger ones would, because they wouldn't be as attractive to investors.
Okay, thank you.
All right, further questions for this witness? Seeing none? Oh, I'm sorry.
What is it? You had the floor already.
Yeah, well, we just, it's arbitrary, but from the discussions we've had with financial advisors, $2 million we felt like was issues over $2 million. And I can have some statistics for you there too. I mean, just to give you a background, on our analysis, we had 538 bonds issued over 4 years that were general obligation, worth about $3.1 billion. Of that, if you took those $2 million ones and below out, you're still left with a significant amount. Where is it?
I think you're still left with over 93% of the bonds, dollar-wise, and about 2/3 of them.
65% of the bonds are remaining, and 93.5% of the dollars. So it's a significant chunk of the dollars is over the $2 million, while there's a significant number of smaller bonds that are under that amount. So that would still allow some of that local participation on those smaller bonds.
I have another question, sir. Are there any extra services or expertise that the negotiated underwriter could be doing for a school district? You know, take like a superintendent, he may do one in his career or something.
Right.
So what else is there? Is there something, is there another number somewhere that is of value to them?
Well, I think what comes into play here is you're right. I mean, these superintendents might.
I don't know if I'm right or not.
No, you're right, because some of these superintendents, they don't do these very often. Some of them do, larger district jobs issue bonds all the time, but some of them don't. And so they need a professional to help them do these things. And so what you see is a lot of the services that the underwriters are providing in a negotiated sale are actually more financial advisory services in nature. And you can hire an independent financial advisor. You can hire all these guys, the underwriters that do these negotiated sales, you can hire them as an independent financial advisor to help you structure the bond just like they do now.
But that would be a cost, right?
There would be a cost,
That would
yes.
be a cost, and maybe it's rolled in on the other side.
Correct, right.
Is that,
Financial advisory services are typically offered at a set amount. I'll do it for whatever, $25,000 or whatever the case may be. And so there is a stated cost to a financial advisor where on the negotiated side, that some of those fees are sometimes not as easy to see.
I know, but was that taken into consideration on the 20 basis point savings?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yes, it was.
I'm a numbers kind of guy, I like to know what the net deal is.
Sure, yes. The 20 basis points in our analysis, we netted any financial advisor costs on the competitive sales. We netted those costs into those deals. So yes, those savings are net of any such costs.
Thank you.
Other questions for the witness? Seeing none, thank you both for testifying. Please leave your witness forms. Who else do we have to speak in favor? Please come forward, introduce yourself, and leave a witness form.
Kate Costello. process with the Children's Education Council of Missouri. Just want to go on the record in support. If you have any questions, I refer them back to the auditor's office, as I am also not a financial advisor or CPA, but I believe the 4 auditors have found that this will save particularly school districts money, that money could be better spent in the classrooms, and paying teachers and those kinds of things.
Questions for the witness, Senator Lyle?
So your support then would be based on the findings,
Of the auditors, yes.
predominantly what the auditor said?
This auditor and the previous ones as well, yes.
Not necessarily talking to school districts or anything like that?
That's right.
Other questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Please leave a witness form. And I think that was everyone to speak in favor. Was there anyone else to speak in favor of the Senate bill? All right, and how many did we, if you would again, raise your hand if you're going to be speaking against. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, well, listen, I don't know if you witnesses need to go have a huddle out in the hallway for a minute, but you're going to have 10 minutes, which is the same amount of time the other side had. So you're going to have a maximum of 2 minutes each, so give it your best shot. Line up. It'd be a good idea for whoever's going to be next to be on deck and ready to go.
So we just go and sit down?
Please
Mr.
proceed.
Chairman, Jim Moody representing George K. Baum, one of the underwriting firms headquartered in Kansas City. I will try and get through this quickly. First, in terms of the question of do underwriters usually bid on a competitive sale by themselves, I would answer no. I think the answer given previously was incorrect, with all due respect. The Lindbergh example, my clients bid as part of a syndicate, which is a bidding group of, I think, 12 firms, and that's to spread the risk. And the successful bidder was an out-of-state firm, and I think they had 8 firms in their syndicate. So I would probably disagree with that. I think the audit report attempts to prove what is unprovable, whether one form of sale is better than the other. We don't think you can prove that. The last audit done by Auditor McCaskill, we had former Representative Ed Robb, who at the time was an economics professor at the University of Missouri, examined the audit, and he said the same thing. You can't prove what they say they're proving. Just for your information, a competitive sale, you set the date, usually maybe 10 days, 2 weeks in advance. You give notice to the public, and you accept interest rates. So if you're taking risk by being an underwriter, you don't know whether you've got any bonds or not. And basically, when I say taking the risk, you're putting your money at risk. Most underwriters are not in the business of what I call investing for their own account, bidding their own money and holding it. They're in the buying and selling business. So you don't know if you have a product to sell. Whereas a negotiated sale, you know that you're going to have the bonds on a certain date and you can pre-market them. I would specifically like to talk about school districts. The direct deposit program that is used by most school districts in Missouri, they get a program rating. If they participate in the program, they get, it's a AA+ rating right now. Prior to that program, which started in 1995, most school districts were unrated. And I know a fair amount about that program because in 1995, a lady named Amelia Bond and I went to New York to the rating agencies and said, what can we do to get these school districts rating? And the answer was, if you take their debt service payment out of their school aid formula payment and then allow them to reimburse school aid from their debt service levy, you would get, at the time it was a AA rating. To be honest with you, even though this program rating exists and it's a good thing, it did nothing to improve the underlying credit quality of most of these school districts. And so on any given day, yes, if you get a super strong credit, take a Lindbergh, you can probably sell those competitively. You take a small district, school district, where I live here in Jefferson City, is surrounded by small school districts, and there is not unlimited demand out there for those bonds. And many of those issuances are going to be well above the $2 billion or whatever threshold that has been examined here. So I think the auditor, with all due respect, they do not understand how the financial markets work here and the supply and demand, and there is limited interest. And my firm would be a bidder on bonds sometimes in a competitive sale. Other times we might not. The large banks might be. Other times they may not. The small banks are probably going to get their supply of bonds through a company like ours or through a large bank. And so, again, the underwriting community and the willingness to buy these things at the lowest possible price, we don't think exists day to day. And again, we think that the credit quality of some of these credits is hidden a little bit because of the program rating from the direct deposit program. Stop there, Mr. Chairman.
All right, do we have questions for this witness? Senator Shaw.
Jim, if this bill were to pass, do you believe that the citizens of various school districts would end up having to pay more interest for the money that they?
They may or may not. As a bidder, certain times, our incentive is to bid relatively high, hope there's not a big pool of bidders, and that we get a good product at a high interest rate, you know, in a competitive sale. I mean, it is a balancing act. Let me give you the example where I think competitive sale makes sense.
You're in the business to make money.
Absolutely. When the state of Missouri, which is AAA, sells its bond, they sell them competitive sale. We think that's just fine. Okay? And they're not in the market very much. They're typically going to have a lot of bonds where you can put a big syndicate together. And whereas, you know, XYZ school district out here that's doing $5 million worth of bonds.
So your argument basically is that the audit is flawed because the school districts are small and are not highly rated, and therefore they won't attract a significant number of
And
bidders.
the other thing,
Is that correct?
in the sample, the auditor, they have got this direct deposit program rating, and they've also got some school districts in there that went and got rated on their own. And why would you, if you had a AA+ rating, why would you go get rated on your own? And the answer is it improves your credit quality. Okay, and so they've got some of those districts who also have a rating on their own in their sample.
Do you believe that if this bill were to become law, that some school districts would not be able to raise money through bonding?
You are going to have a witness who's going to talk to you about an example within the last 2 weeks, a city that's tried to sell competitively and could not sell their bonds. I'm going to defer to him.
Thank you.
All right, other questions for this witness? You know, thank you for your
Chairman, thank you.
testimony. Who's going to be next? Yes, sir, if you would introduce yourself to the committee and if you would keep your testimony to about 2 minutes.
Very good. My name is Kenneth Bradhurst, and I'm here on the behest of the Missouri Independent Bankers Association. And I'd like to speak on this bill as a market participant. Okay, I'm not a theorist, I'm not an academic, but I'm here as somebody that's been in this market for 44 years now, and I think I do have some feeling about it. First of all, I want to say that the Missouri Independent Bankers Association and the Missouri Bankers Association are in opposition to this bill. And I have a couple reasons for that, specifically with the banks. The banks like local issues, and local issuers like their local bank to be able to buy some of the bonds. It's that simple. The banks work with these school districts all year long. They work with them on many things besides just bond issues. Several people have mentioned bond issues may come once or twice, or every 5 years or every 10 years. But the bankers like access to these bonds. And the second reason is, as the gentleman from the auditor's office mentioned, the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. Banks get credit for this when they buy the local securities. And if they do not have local securities, it becomes much more difficult for them to meet all of these requirements. Now, the obvious question is, why if you buy general obligation bonds, or why if it goes general election, why are the banks not able to get that securities that they want? And the answer is very simple. When you go to a competitive bid situation and everything that you do, there is obviously going to be bidders coming in from New York, Chicago, etc. And those people are not going to reissue the bonds to the local banks or the local investors, for that matter, in their community. If Chase comes in and buys a Missouri deal, whatever it may be, Columbia, whatever, the chances of them going to the local banks and saying, would you like some of these bonds? This is what's here, would you like some? The chances of that happening are almost nil. They have huge mutual funds that they can sell to. They have huge trust departments that they can sell to. They have huge bank portfolios that they can sell to. They don't need the local community.